Hi, I'm going to start. This marks the beginning of a series of videos that I'm going to start here. Which this is going to mark the series, the beginning of a group of videos in philosophy of religion. Just because I find that a lot of that interesting, all the different traditional arguments, and I want to work through all those things here, talking about that here. And I'm mostly going to be working out of this book. The Philosophy of Religion is it's an anthology by Louis Poyman. I think that he makes he edits really good anthologies, and he puts really good stuff together because he is himself a very good philosopher. But I'm going to start here because the book starts off with the ontological argument, because it is the only argument, the only traditional argument for the existence of God that is a priori, and furthermore, this is the only one that starts with a reductio ad absurdum. So I guess this is very interesting, and this is mostly going to be through. I'm gonna do two videos on this. One's going to be with Anselm and the monk who responds to him, and then plus Anselm's objection, and then the other video is going to be on Kant's critique of Anselm's argument. And then also in this video I'm going to discuss the formulation of the argument by Alvin Plantinga. So basically what the ontological argument is, I'm going to read the part that this book includes, which is from the Proslogian. Therefore, Lord, you who grant understanding to faith, grant that insofar as you know it is useful for me, I may understand that you exist as we believe you exist, and that you are what we believe you to be. That there is that this is the beginning of an argument which is called a reductio ad absurdum, and that's basically a argument which starts with a assumption which is contradictory to what he's trying to prove. Because he's trying to prove that God does exist, not only in the understanding but in actual reality, and that he does exist. But this is the beginning assumption, which is contrary to what he's trying to prove. So this is the reductio. I may understand that you exist as we believe you exist, and that you are what we believe you to be. Now we believe that you are something than which nothing greater can be thought. So can it be that no such nature exists, since the fool has said in his heart, there is no God, Psalm 14:1 and Psalm 53:1. But when this same fool hears me say, something than which nothing greater can be thought, he surely understands what he hears, and what he understands exists in his understanding, even if he does not understand that it exists in reality. For it is one thing for an object to exist in the understanding, and quite another to exist that the object exists in reality. So I'm not gonna read this whole thing, but I've read through the whole thing, and I want to explain it. Not only through the way I understand it, but the way that Alvin Plantinga formulates it. There are quite a few philosophers who my phone's dying. Sorry. There are quite a few philosophers who formulate this argument and they map out what his argument really is. They map out what's going on throughout his philosophy here. So basically what's going on is he's saying that God is something than which nothing greater can be conceived. So I'm going to discuss here the formulation by Alvin Plantinga. Now first we have the assumption which is contradictory to what he's trying to prove, which makes the reductio. His first assumption is God exists in the understanding, but not in reality. So mostly the first assumption is that God exists in the mind. That is the first assumption. Now, one of the premises is existence in reality is greater than existence in understanding alone. So I'm just going through Plantinga's formulation. Among there are others like Barnes and Adams and others who have formulations of Anselm's argument. Premise 2: a being having all of God's properties plus existence in reality can be conceived. And then we infer from the assumption and from the first premise that a being having all of God's properties plus existence in reality is greater than God. And then from this inference, from the assumption and the first premise, we infer that a being greater than God can be conceived. But then Plantinga, he discusses Anselm by bringing in with the formulation the definition of God by Anselm, that it is false that a being greater than God can be conceived. So we're talking about God as in our ability to conceive things. We're talking about God as the greatest thing that we can conceive in our mind. And then we infer from this definition as well as our previous inference. So yeah, we have this previous inference: a being greater than God can be conceived. But then we have the definition of God as it is false that a being greater than God can be conceived. And then we infer from this that hence it is false that God exists in the understanding but not in reality. And then God exists in the understanding, and thus God exists in reality. So that is Plantinga's formulation of Anselm's argument. So basically, what we have here is, and I guess I better understand this through the objection given by a monk named Gaunilo. His objection is better, I think. Well, it makes you better understand it. But basically, here's what his argument is. This is a argument which is not empirical. We're not arguing based upon empirical things. This is a priori. So basically, the first assumption is God exists in the understanding, but not in the reality. And then we have the first premise, which is God exists or that existence in reality is greater than existence in the understanding alone. And then from the assumption in the first premise, we conclude that a being having all of God's properties plus existence in reality is greater than God. And then plus premise 2, we have a being having all of God's properties plus existence in reality can be conceived. Which is true, I think. A being having all of God's properties plus existence in reality can be conceived, because everybody conceives it all the time. Because plus we have Christopher Hitchens, who has talked about in a debate that people do conceive of it, regardless of whether, sometimes where there is no, tons of times where there's no certainty whether there is that in reality also. And then from all these things we infer that a being greater than God can be conceived. But then I guess I'm wondering, here is the definition of God by Anselm. It is false that a being greater than God can be conceived. Can a being greater than God be conceived? And I would say no, because the reason that all the debate about God occurs is because that's why there's dogma in it. Otherwise, there'd be dogma about that thing greater than God. And then because of these things, hence it is false that God exists in the understanding but not in reality. Now that's where I have the problem. Just because of the fact, both basically he's inferring that it's false that God exists only in the understanding. He's inferring that from the fact that a being having all of God's properties plus existence in reality is greater than God. He's inferring it from that, plus a being greater than God can be conceived, but then defining God, he's inferring all of that from those things. But then his argument. But then but then he also says that God exists in the understanding, and thus his argument and his conclusion is that God exists in reality. And then we have Gaunilo, which is he's criticizing Anselm for this. For example, there are those who say that somewhere in the ocean is an island, which, because of the difficulty or rather impossibility of finding what does not exist, some call the lost island. This island, so the story goes, is more plentifully endowed than even the Isles of the Blessed, with an indescribable abundance of all sorts of riches and delights. And because it has neither owner nor inhabitant, it is everywhere superior in its abundant riches to all the other lands that human beings inhabit. Suppose someone tells me all this. The story is easily told and involves no difficulty, and so I understand it. But if this person went on to draw a conclusion and say, you cannot any longer doubt that this island, more excellent than all others on earth, truly exists somewhere in reality, for you do not doubt that this island exists in your understanding, and since it is more excellent to exist not merely in the understanding but also in reality, this island must also exist in reality. For if it did not, any land that exists in reality would be greater than it. And so this is more excellent than this more excellent thing that you have understood would not in fact be more excellent. If I say he should try to convince me by this argument that I should no longer doubt whether this island truly exists, either I would think that he was joking, or I would not know whom I thought to think more foolish myself if I grant him his conclusion, or him if he thinks he has established the existence of that island with any degree of certainty, without first showing that its excellence exists in my understanding as a thing that truly and undoubtedly exists, and not in any way like something false or uncertain. So basically, we're talking. Gaunilo is comparing Anselm's idea of God to this lost island, which in this lost island is better than any island that humans have inhabited. We're talking about an island that has tons of riches, and it's just wonderful. It's the best island that anybody could think about. And he's saying that couldn't you conceive of a better island, or a much better one? You could conceive of this lost island, which is wonderful, and its riches and all that stuff. You could conceive of it, but then you could outdo yourself. You could conceive of something which is much more abundant in riches and much more luxurious. You could continue to go higher and higher and higher in your conception of the island. You could just keep going, because you have the possibility of conceiving of a better and better island. That is Gaunilo's objection, because you have to compare the island to God. God being defined as something as to which something greater cannot be conceived. God is the thing to where you cannot conceive something greater than Him. And Gaunilo is saying that Gaunilo is saying that Anselm is basically pulling rabbits out of hats, mostly. That's the best way I can put it. And mostly that what's going on here is that we're talking about the possibility that we could, get more and more extravagant, and more great in this conception of God. But then Anselm responds to this criticism and says, well, the property of luxury and riches in the properties of luxury and the property of abundance in an island are different than greatness in God, and like the idea of God and his existence and the existence of a very luxurious island. Those are two different things, and you really cannot. The whole analogy doesn't really work because the idea of a God being a creator is different than an island, and that's why he really shoots down Gaunilo's criticism, because, and I think they are two different things. I could constantly keep going with respect to keep going higher and higher with respect to luxurious and abundantly rich islands and more lost better and better islands. I could just keep on going, and you really don't have a stopping point there. But what I like about the way Anselm looks at God is that this God is omnipotent, omnibenevolent, and omniscient. And this is, I think, I'm pretty sure that this is the argument that portrays God in the best way, because he looks at him in that way. He looks at him as omnipotent, omnibenevolent, and omniscient. And you cannot really think of a deity. If we're talking a great being, a great existent thing, who is omnipotent, omnibenevolent, and omniscient, you cannot really you can't really keep going with greatness there. That is the standard. You cannot conceive of anything greater than that. But then the problem here is, does this really prove that God exists? Does this really prove that this omnipotent, omnibenevolent, and omniscient thing exists? Does it really prove that? And I would say that just because you can conceive of something doesn't mean that it really exists. I'm going to go back to Plantinga's formulation here. Existence in reality is greater than existence in the understanding alone. And then from that and the contradictory assumption, we get the fact that a being having all of God's properties plus existence in reality is great. And then from that, plus the second premise of a being having all of God's properties plus existence in reality can be conceived, we get the fact that a being greater than God can be conceived. And then we define God by saying that it's false that a being greater than God can be conceived. And then from those things we get, hence it is false that God exists in the understanding but not in reality. That is where I see the problem of Anselm's argument. I don't really see that works, because there are tons of places where God exists in the understanding but not in reality. God exists in many places, intersubjectively in many understandings, and we have a bunch of people who are gathered in that. But this does not mean that God exists in reality as as a particular which is, great like this, So yeah, I really think that this is something to look upon, and if we're going to prove God, then we need to look at it in the way that Anselm does, even though he doesn't prove it correctly. I mean, he doesn't. His proof is a priori, and we need to look back on this constantly if we're trying to prove God through empirical things, as well as a priori things. I think we need to look at this, but realize that it doesn't totally connect. It doesn't totally connect from having him exist in the understanding to him existing in reality.